The door will not open. Someone inside is pulling against it with both hands, and someone outside is holding it shut with a spear, braced through the handle. And for a moment that is the entire war, one door, two sides, and smoke starting to curl underneath the frame. Above the noise, a farmhouse roof is catching fire in a country most of the men inside have never seen a map of. Somewhere close by, a bodyguard makes a decision he will spend the rest of his life explaining. He goes out through a window instead. We will come back to that door. Not yet. 2 years earlier, none of this looks like a fire waiting to happen. It looks like an opportunity. In the autumn of the year 376, tens of thousands of people arrive at the edge of the Roman world with nothing but what they carried across a swollen river. They are Gothic families, the refugee, pushed out of their own lands by a people the Romans call the Huns, a name that alone is enough to make grown warriors abandon their homes rather than face them. They stand on the far bank of the Danube and ask for something simple. Let us in. The Eastern Roman Emperor, a man named Valens, says yes. On paper, it is a good deal for everyone. Rome gets farmers for its empty fields and soldiers for its underfilled legions. The Goths get land, protection, and a future that does not involve the Huns. There is even a word for this arrangement: foederati, allied peoples settled inside the empire in exchange for their swords when Rome needs them. It has worked before. It should work now. It does not work now. Because the moment these families cross the river, they stop being refugees in the eyes of history and start being a resource. Grain to be rationed, land to be assigned, numbers to be managed. And the men Rome puts in charge of managing them are not interested in making the arrangement work. They are interested in what they can take from it. Two names matter here more than any general the Goths will ever face in open battle. Lupicinus, Maximus. Neither man will swing a sword during what happens next. They do not need to. They control something more useful than an army. They control the food. Lupicinus holds the title of Magister Militum for Thrace, Master of Soldiers, the top Roman military authority in the province. In theory, the title means he commands troops. In practice, on this frontier in this crisis, it means he commands the scales. Every family crossing into Roman territory needs grain. Lupicinus and Maximus control where that grain comes from and what it costs. And so the price of a loaf begins to climb, not for Roman citizens, only for the Goths, only for the people who have no other market to turn to and no way home. A starving man does not negotiate. He pays what is asked, or he watches his children starve instead. This kind of corruption rarely announces itself. It does not arrive as a single dramatic crime. It arrives as 100 small decisions, each one just barely survivable, each one designed so that the man making them can tell himself he has done nothing that unusual. A slightly inflated price here, a slightly late shipment there, a guard who looks the other way for the right coin. By the time the pattern is undeniable, it has already been running for months. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus was writing close enough to these events to have spoken with men who lived through them, and what he recorded is difficult to say aloud without pausing. Families reduced to trading their own children into slavery. For dog meat, not for gold, not for land, for meat from dogs, because that was what the Roman markets along the frontier were willing to accept in place of coin they no longer had. Sit with that for a second. An empire that called itself the height of civilization was running a black market in starvation on its own riverbank, and the people running it wore Roman rank. This is not a story that needs the Goths to be innocent to make its point. Refugee columns rarely are, and the ancient sources make clear that resentment among the Goths was already boiling before a single Roman blade was drawn against them. But resentment is not what turns a settlement into a war. Betrayal is. And the second betrayal is the one that makes the first one unforgivable. Word reaches the Roman commander at Marcianople that the Gothic leaders are becoming difficult to manage. Fritigern and Alavivus, the two men holding the refugee together, are summoned to what is presented as a diplomatic dinner. A chance to smooth things over, share a meal, remind everyone that peace is still possible. It is the oldest trick available to a man who has run out of honest options. Invite the leadership inside. Close the door behind them. Lupicinus's soldiers move on Fritigern's bodyguards inside the walls of Marcianople. Alavivus is killed in the chaos. Fritigern survives, barely, by some accounts through nothing more than the confusion of the moment and his own nerve, and gets out with a handful of men still breathing. He does not go quietly. By the time Fritigern reaches his people again, waiting in the hills outside the city, he does not need a speech. The story tells itself. Rome invited us to dinner and murdered our king. Whatever patience these families had for the arrangement they agreed to 2 years ago is finished, and it did not end because the Goths broke faith first. Here is the part that should unsettle you more than a battlefield does. Nothing about this outcome required Gothic strength. It required exactly one kind of Roman weakness: the specific, ordinary weakness of men given control over desperate people, and no one watching closely enough to stop them from taking whatever they wanted. Lupicinus did not lose a war of arms in these early months. He started one out of greed and lost the peace before a single legion had to march. The empire that will nearly collapse at Adrianople does not begin collapsing on that battlefield. It begins collapsing at a market stall on the Danube, in a transaction nobody in Rome ever bothered to audit. Let's pause here for a second, because it's worth being precise about what kind of story this actually is. This is not a video about barbarians at the gates. It is not a video about Rome being too weak to hold its borders against a stronger enemy. Every piece of the disaster so far has been caused by Roman hands. A Roman price on grain, a Roman dinner invitation, a Roman blade drawn first inside the walls of Marcianople. The Goths did not arrive as conquerors. They arrived as refugees, and Rome's own officers turned them into an army instead. If you're finding this as unsettling as I did researching it, that's the right reaction, because the worst part of the story hasn't happened yet. Everything up to now has been theft and murder on a local scale. 2 corrupt officials, 1 province, 1 bad afternoon at a dinner table. What comes next is an emperor who has every reason to know better, making the exact same mistake at the scale of an entire field army. If this kind of institutional failure story is the reason you're here, subscribe. This channel exists for exactly this: the moment ordinary greed or ordinary pride becomes historical catastrophe. And drop a comment below on what you think Valens should have done differently at this point in the story. You'll get your chance to see if you're right, because right now, 2 years out from that dinner in Marcianople, the man who could have stopped all of this is not even in the country. Valens has spent most of this crisis fighting the wrong war, while Lupicinus was extorting refugees, and Fritigern was rebuilding an army out of grief. The Eastern Roman Emperor was hundreds of miles away in Antioch, managing a long and exhausting standoff with the Persian Empire on Rome's eastern frontier. That is the job an Eastern emperor is supposed to be doing. Persia is the rival that keeps Roman strategists awake at night. Not a few thousand displaced farming families led across the Danube on what looked, at the time, like generous terms. By the time the scale of the Gothic revolt becomes impossible to ignore, 2 years have already passed. Fritigern's Thervingi have joined with the Grotthungi Goths under 2 other commanders, Alathius and Saphrax, and together they have been moving through the Balkans virtually unchecked. Roman forces win skirmishes, Roman forces lose skirmishes. Nobody wins the war, because nobody sent enough of an army to actually end it. The fighting at a place called Ad Salices, the Battle of the Willows, leaves both sides bloodied and neither side broken. It is the kind of stalemate that tells you a bigger reckoning is still coming. The word that explains everything about what happens next isn't a weapon. It's logistics. An army does not run on courage, it runs on food, water, and timing delivered to the right place before the men carrying weapons starve or dehydrate first. Rome's failure at this stage isn't a failure of soldiers. It's a failure of supply and coordination, the same failure, at a larger scale, that started this whole war on a riverbank 2 years earlier. Valens finally decides to take the field himself in the year 378. He gathers troops from his eastern campaigns and marches them the length of the empire. Weeks of dust on the road out of Antioch, saddle-sore men who have not seen this frontier before, and arrives near Constantinople in early summer. Word goes out to his nephew, Gratian, the young emperor ruling the western half of Rome, asking for reinforcements. Gratian agrees. He begins moving troops east from Gaul. This should be good news. 2 Roman armies, converging on one Gothic force, would very likely settle the war in Rome's favor through sheer weight of numbers alone. That is, in fact, exactly the plan. But plans built on cooperation have a way of running into the one variable no strategist can fully control: pride. Valens is not popular. He has spent his reign in the shadow of his brother's memory and under constant, quiet suspicion from the Roman aristocracy that he is not quite equal to the throne he holds. A decisive solo victory over the Goths, achieved before his nephew's army even arrives on the field, would be the kind of triumph that silences doubters for good. A victory shared with Gratian is still a victory. It is just not the same kind of victory. Scouts report that the Gothic force encamped north of Adrianople numbers around 10,000 men. Against Valens's own field army, freshly reinforced from Syria, that looks like favorable odds. Maybe even overwhelming ones. Then a letter arrives from Gratian's camp, carried by one of his senior officers, a man named Ricimeres. The message is simple. Wait. Let the 2 armies combine before engaging. There is no military reason to rush this fight, and every reason to be patient. Valens's own officers, reading the same intelligence, largely agree. Wait for Gratian. There's no cost to waiting except pride, and every reason in the world to pay that particular cost gladly. He does not wait. What the scouts got wrong is the reason everything after this goes wrong. The 10,000 Goths spotted near Adrianople are not the whole Gothic force. A significant portion of Gothic cavalry, led by Alathius and Saphrax, is not present in that count at all. They are out foraging, somewhere beyond the Roman scouts' line of sight, and nobody on the Roman side has confirmed where they actually are or when they might return. Fritigern, meanwhile, is doing something that should have been a warning sign in itself. He is stalling. He sends an emissary proposing peace, offering an alliance in exchange for territory. Terms that, on their face, look reasonable for a war that has already dragged on 2 exhausting years with no resolution for either side. Valens rejects it, not because the terms are unreasonable, because he believes, wrongly, that he currently holds the advantage, and a man convinced he is winning rarely stops to ask why his enemy suddenly wants to talk. August 9th, 378. The morning starts the way disasters often do, with nothing that looks like a warning at all, just heat and a march. Valens leads his army 8 miles north from Adrianople under a sun that, by midday, has turned the road into something closer to a furnace. There is no time built into the schedule for rest. There is barely time built in for water. By the time the Roman column comes within sight of the Gothic position, the men have been marching for hours on empty stomachs and dry throats. And what they see waiting for them on the rising ground ahead is not an open battlefield. It is a fortress made of wagons. Fritigern has arranged his people's carts into a wide defensive ring. A wagon lager, packed with families, supplies, and whatever the Goths still owned after 2 years of war. It sits on elevated ground, and the Goths, aware the Romans are coming, have set fire to the surrounding fields so that the entire approach is choked with drifting smoke on top of the August heat. Fritigern sends envoys forward, more talk of peace, more delay. By now you might expect Valens to recognize the pattern. Every time the Goths have wanted to stall, something has been missing from the picture. But the Roman army isn't in a mood to be patient anymore either. Not after an 8-mile march in full sun, not with a fortified enemy sitting in plain view, refusing to fight like an honest army is supposed to. Negotiations drag on. Roman soldiers, exhausted, thirsty, and staring at wagons instead of open ground, start to lose whatever discipline held them together on the march. Some units on the Roman right simply attack. Without orders, without warning, whatever plan existed collapses in the same instant it was meant to begin. For a short while, it almost works anyway. Roman infantry pushes hard toward the wagon circle, gaining ground, driving the Gothic line back toward their own families and supplies. If the battle had ended in that hour, this would be a very different video. It does not end in that hour, because somewhere beyond the smoke, the missing piece of the Gothic army has finally come home. Alathius and Saphrax return from foraging with their full cavalry force, and they do not arrive quietly. Ammianus describes them descending like a thunderbolt, a phrase that has survived 1,700 years because nobody has ever improved on it. Gothic and allied Alan horsemen slam into the exposed Roman cavalry on the flank, and the Roman line, which had never fully finished forming up before the fighting started, does not hold. The Roman left collapses first, crushed in Ammianus's own words, as if by the downfall of a mighty rampart. Once the flank goes, the infantry in the center has nowhere to retreat and no one covering their sides. What follows is not really a battle anymore. It is a killing floor. Men packed too tightly to lift their shields, trampling their own dead, with cavalry riding down anyone who tried to break for open ground. 2/3 of the Roman field army dies in an afternoon, and somewhere in that chaos, in the dust and the smoke and the screaming, the Emperor of Rome disappears. Nobody can say for certain what happened to Valens in his final hour, and the ancient sources themselves disagree, which, if anything, tells you how total the collapse really was. No one had time to watch an emperor die and remember it clearly. One version says he fell in the crush of the retreat, an anonymous casualty among thousands. His body never identified in the field afterward. Another, the version most historians find plausible, says he was carried wounded into a nearby farmhouse with a handful of guards. Hoping to make a stand or wait out the chaos, the Goths find the farmhouse. They try to force the door. It does not give, so they burn it instead. This is the door from the beginning of this video. This is the fire. A man who ruled the Eastern Roman Empire, who dismissed a peace offer because he believed the numbers favored him, who chose solo glory over waiting 3 or 4 more days for his nephew's army. That man may have died inside a burning building. He could not escape. While one bodyguard alone made it out through a window to tell what little of the story anyone would ever know for certain. This is not a story about barbarian strength overwhelming Roman weakness. This is not a story about one bad general or one bad battle. This is a story about what happens when an empire spends 2 years teaching an entire people that Roman promises mean nothing, and then sends its emperor onto the same battlefield, still refusing to learn the lesson. There's a version of this failure that has nothing to do with the 4th century at all. Anywhere a government controls resources that displaced people depend on to survive. Food, water, paperwork, shelter. The danger is never really the displaced people themselves. It's the officials standing between them and what they need when nobody senior enough is watching what those officials do with that power. Lupicinus proved it on a riverbank in 376. Valens proved 2 years later that pride can make the exact same mistake all over again, just with an entire army standing behind it instead of a grain scale. So what do you actually take from an afternoon like this, 1700 years later? First, the truth of what happened here. Adrianople is remembered as the battle where barbarians broke Rome, but the record doesn't really support that story. The Goths, who destroyed 2/3 of an imperial field army, were, 2 years earlier, refugees asking for permission to farm empty land. What turned them into the force that ended an emperor's life wasn't their strength. It was Roman corruption at a river crossing, a massacre disguised as a dinner invitation, and a proud man's refusal to wait 4 more days for help that was already on its way. Second, what this means for how you look at institutions, any institution, not just a Roman one. The failure at Adrianople didn't come from an enemy outside the gates. It came from men inside the system who had power over desperate people, and no one senior enough checking what they did with it. That pattern doesn't need togas and Gothic wagons to repeat itself. It just needs unwatched power and someone willing to use it. And third, the part that actually stayed with me after going through Ammianus's account line by line. Valens had an exit. Gratian's letter was sitting in his camp, urging patience, promising an army that could have made this fight almost unwinnable for the Goths. All he had to do was wait. He chose a burning farmhouse instead, because waiting felt smaller than winning alone. And by the time he understood what that choice actually cost, there was no door left that would open. Which part of this hit hardest for you? The extortion at the river, the massacre at the dinner table, or the emperor who wouldn't wait 4 more days? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. Rome would survive Adrianople. The western half of the empire would not survive what it started.